What is going on, you guys? MissedThePart here, back again with another fanfiction scenario, and in today's video I will be looking at what would have happened if Peter Parker's Uncle Ben had lived in the first 2002 film. How would this have changed Spider-Man 2002 and the future movies? The most famous and biggest scene in the Raimi trilogy was when Peter didn't get the money and he was in the hallway. He let the robber go and Peter went outside only to see his uncle die in his hands on that very night, and it kicked off the rest of the film, leading all the way to Spider-Man 3 with Peter confronting Flint Marko at the end of the movie and forgiving him. We are going to be looking at 4 alternate scenarios and breaking down and analyzing each timeline and see how these alternate realities would play out if one small change happened. This will be a shorter format and you will be able to choose your path in the description down below, and before you do, please make sure you support the channel by giving a subscribe and liking the video. But anyways, as always, choose your path, guys.
I forgive you.
The first act of Spider-Man 2002 is a massive setup with Peter Parker learning with great power comes great responsibility, and he learned this the hard way after being selfish not getting his $3,000 from the wrestling host. He wanted the car to impress Mary Jane, but he failed, letting his selfish acts kill Ben Parker. But what if this didn't happen in the hallway scene in the first act of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man? What if Peter Parker was able to see what he was doing was wrong and give into the words of his Uncle Ben? The scenario has been seen in the original Marvel comic books and already in 2 of my fan fictions with Peter getting the MK1 suit, but I also want to do this scenario in a more realistic way and have fun with it. Peter, like our original timeline, was mad. His plan of getting that car to impress Mary Jane had failed, and the money that he worked and risked for wasn't his now. It was all in his grasp, and now it was lost forever. He walked outside and saw someone enter as he was about to leave the building. Screams were heard as the robber knocked the wrestling host out with a gun. He started running fast and quick, and Peter's spider sense went off. He saw the man with the bag of money running away as he could see the cop trying his hardest to keep up with the guy as he was slipping away from the crime scene. Peter saw flashes of himself as if the universe stopped and told him what needed to be done and the task at hand, save what he lost all those years ago. Peter Parker remembered what Uncle Ben said as flashes of him saying to Peter that he was changing and he saw new things within himself and that he had to be a better man. He knew that he needed to be a better man, even if it meant for him to lose the money and Mary Jane. The robber, just about to escape, he yelled thanks as the elevator door was about to shut and he saw the robber with a gun. Peter moved his hands as the elevator door was about to shut, and he smashed the doors in as he picked the robber up by his shirt and threw him across the hallway as the money was on the ground. Peter looked to see the wrestling host run in on the scene, and Peter slammed the robber's face into the wall and the cop told him to stop. They looked at Peter in shock as he stopped the robber and used his raw strength. In this new timeline, we can branch the realities where Peter gets the $3,000 from the fight and joins the wrestling club, becoming famous almost like the original Marvel Comics What Ifs. Or we can change it where Peter becomes the better man, still not giving into his selfishness, leaving the money with the guy, making him feel bad about his greed. I think the best option for our alternate reality is going to be going with option 2. Peter webs up the bag of money, giving it back to the guy, and the guy tried giving it to Peter, but he said that he missed the part where that was his problem, and the guy was shocked hearing this. Peter walked outside as he saw a man pointing a gun at his Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben asked the guy to put down the gun and go home, and the man looked in the distance as Peter yelled for his Uncle Ben, and the guy put his gun away as he went into the car driving off. He started speeding, and Peter knew that he needed to get his uncle's car back and stop the robber before he got somebody killed. He had a responsibility, and he knew that he was the one that put Uncle Ben in that position, but if he did go after the second robber, he was going to expose his powers, and he would. Peter swung in the air as Uncle Ben looked shocked, seeing that Peter had these powers that he's never seen before. He knew that he was changing, and he yelled for Peter's name, but he was halfway down the street. Peter went full on Spider-Man, chasing the guy to the warehouse, and the man pointing his gun in the shadows as Peter jumped from below, using his foot to kick it out of the robber's hand. He tried running, but Peter punched him in the face and he went flying into a wall. Peter kneed him in the gut and he used his two hands to pick up the man almost unconscious on the ground. The man said, "Give me a chance," but Peter said, "What about my uncle? What do you want with him?" And the man explained that he needed the money for his daughter because she was dying. He explained that he needed a getaway car and that his Uncle Ben's was the perfect one. Peter let the man go and he started crying, and Peter said, "I forgive you," and the man tripped over a metal pipe by accident trying to walk forward, but he fell and Peter screamed no as he tried using his webs to save him, but he fell to his death, crashing his back into the docks below. He jumped out of the window and the cops saw Flint Marko's dead body on the ground, and the police looked within Ben Parker's car, and Peter failed, knowing that he could have been caught for murder if he tried to retrieve his vehicle. Peter went on top of the building crying, knowing that he could have used his powers for good, trying to save the man, but he failed. His anger got to him and he was distracted, letting his emotions kill the man by accident after they forgave each other. Peter went home after a long night not getting Uncle Ben's car, and Aunt May and Uncle Ben stood in the living room seeing Peter come home. They saw on the news that the robber was killed, and Peter tried to explain to Uncle Ben and Aunt May that he was only trying to get the car back, but he failed, not being able to save the man in time. Uncle Ben yelled, telling Peter that he got somebody killed because he was selfish just going after the car. He told Peter that they didn't need the car and that it wasn't important. Peter put his head down, knowing that he was right, and Uncle Ben told Peter that he was doing good things for other people and that was okay, but he hasn't learned what power and responsibility was. Uncle Ben in our new timeline told Peter to take his hand, and Peter looked at him. Uncle Ben said that they could help him become the better man and the hero he should be, but after today something like this can't happen ever again. And Peter took Uncle Ben's hand, shaking it, learning with great power comes great responsibility. Throughout the movies, Uncle Ben would still be alive, and Spider-Man fought the Green Goblin at the end of the film, almost like the original timeline. He saved Norman Osborn as he used his webs in midair to catch the glider. Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius teamed up in the second movie, and since Peter's uncle is still alive, he wouldn't have guilt for the events of the first film, so Peter wouldn't lose his powers in Spider-Man 2. Doc Ock and the Green Goblin would team up trying to defeat Spider-Man, but Spider-Man won and actually killed both Norman and Otto in this timeline. Peter and Mary Jane would still be together, and John Jameson wouldn't go with Mary Jane like the original Spider-Man 2 timeline. Spider-Man came across the symbiote in the third film, and Harry Osborn would become the new Goblin, learning that Spider-Man killed his father at the docks, and he would be given the company in Spider-Man 3. Peter revealed the powers of the symbiote, and Uncle Ben let Peter keep the symbiote for a bit, but then Uncle Ben realized that Peter was changing and he had to remove the symbiote. He would remove the symbiote early in the film, and this would make big changes for Venom in Spider-Man 3, as he wouldn't be the main villain of the film, and the main villain would be Harry, and Spider-Man would fight the new Goblin and defeat him, letting him live, and Peter forgave Harry Osborn for what he did at the end of the movie. Flint Marko needed to be at the crime scene and kill Peter's Uncle Ben to let all of the original Spider-Man events play out. He played a minor role within the story, but after killing his Uncle Ben, that was the biggest part of the film and the story. If this didn't happen, all of the original events could change really fast, just like the first choice. What if Peter stopped a robber running away in the hallway in the first act of the film? But what if he chose a more sinister path while stopping the criminals, and he used his rage, becoming irresponsible? This branch reality would be more out of character for Peter, but we're going to be tapping into the rage of Peter Parker while being screwed over with the $3,000, and him having so much rage with the wrestling host and losing Mary Jane to Harry Osborn, knowing that without the car he couldn't impress her, so his whole plan had actually failed. Peter still demanded the $3,000, but he left the room as he saw two people enter in, and he saw someone that had a gun. He didn't know what to do. Before he was about to leave, one of the guys pointed a gun at the wrestling host's head. They knocked him out, and Flint Marko took the money. Peter didn't know what to do, but he was really angry, and one of the robbers pointed a gun at him, and he could see that they were taking his money. He yelled, telling Peter to get out of the way, and that triggered Peter, and he used his webs on the two robbers, but Flint Marko tried to punch Peter in the hallway, and Peter dodged the attack, and Flint's fist went into the wall as Peter broke his arm and smashed his face into the hallway, and it broke his neck. Flint was dead on the ground, and the cop tried shooting, but he dodged the attacks, and the bullet went into the other robber, and he dropped on the ground dead. Peter ran outside of the building, and he saw Uncle Ben's car as he was waiting for Peter outside. Peter crawled up the walls hearing sirens, and he looked at his hands, and he could see that there was blood on it, and there would be a flashback of his Uncle Ben saying that he was going to become some kind of criminal. I want to first explain to you why this is a realistic next scene, and that is because this is the boiling point at the hallway scene. He lost everything with getting the car for Mary Jane, and he lost the money, and at this point Peter felt like he didn't need to do anything, and he wanted his revenge, but since two robbers pointed a gun at him, he used that anger that was already built up inside of him, and he used his full power, and that is why he became a murderer in this timeline, because he was only fighting in the moment and not for the future, so he didn't really know what he was doing until he looked afterwards and he saw that Flint was dead and Dennis Carradine was dead on the ground. For a lot of fan service with this particular scenario, we're going to be doing something never before done, and Peter used his raw strength, not knowing how much power he really had, and since he used it, he killed those two robbers, being irresponsible, and in space, a meteor went into orbit just a bit early in the timeline, coming off course, breaking into the Earth's atmosphere. Peter was crying on top of the building like the original timeline, knowing what he did was wrong and how he acted only in the moment. He looked in the sky to see a meteor and a massive explosion. Peter went to the explosion swinging there, not knowing what it might be, and he looked in the park to see fire and a massive crater in the ground. He front flipped over the crater to see a hole, and he saw a black rock. His spider sense went off, but he just saw black as he was hanging upside down from a building. So instead of Peter learning how to web swinging when he was trying to catch the robbers, he learned how to web swing while having the symbiote, and his powers became 10 times better, and they were increased. Uncle Ben and Aunt May wouldn't find out about Peter killing the two robbers, and Peter kept it as a secret within the symbiote. He would become Venom in the timeline, giving his full power to the symbiote because he hasn't learned with great power comes great responsibility. He treated everyone bad in this timeline, getting into fights with Uncle Ben at the Thanksgiving dinner. Norman Osborn still became the Green Goblin and plotted to switch Spider-Man to his side. Spider-Man still wanted to be a good person with the symbiote that he had on, but he wouldn't be as good as he was in the original timeline. He would actually become a killer. Norman still found out that Peter was Spider-Man grabbing Mary Jane and holding her hostage like the original timeline. Spider-Man went there with the symbiote, and Norman would be scared of Spider-Man, knowing that he wasn't a true hero and that he was far from that and almost being evil like him. He tried to convince Peter to join him by revealing his identity to Mary Jane, and he told her that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. He became consumed by the symbiote and in rage, screaming as his claws went into the air, and Goblin used a bomb, throwing it at Spider-Man, and Spider-Man blew up with the symbiote, and it was damaged badly. Green Goblin threw the kids and kept Mary Jane. Spider-Man saved the children as he followed the Green Goblin to the warehouse. Green Goblin used his glider to try and kill Spider-Man, but like that one scene from Spider-Man 3, he dodged the attack and grabbed the glider from his symbiote whip, and Green Goblin fell, landing his body into the brick wall, and he threw a pumpkin bomb, but Spider-Man dodged the attack, throwing it at him, and he grabbed MJ, but it would be too late. The room went boom and everything was black. Mary Jane died and Peter searched for her, but he saw two skeletons and he knew that he failed. He became evil after, in this timeline, not being able to become Peter Parker, and Uncle Ben and Aunt May tried to contact Peter, but he was fully gone from good, leaving into the city fighting criminals and killing them. Spider-Man 2 would become very different, almost like Spider-Man 3, as Harry Osborn became the new Goblin, and he knew that Spider-Man killed his father and that he wanted revenge. Doc Ock would die in the explosion as he wasn't saved by Peter in this timeline, and the machine would electrocute him to death. Harry teamed up with J. Jonah Jameson at the Daily Bugle, and they would make a deal to find and hunt down Spider-Man. Harry would become the good guy in this timeline, fighting Spider-Man in the city a few times and even on the train. Harry during the fight used a pumpkin bomb and it blew up in Spider-Man's face, and his tendrils were waving around everywhere, and he looked to see his old friend Harry, and all Harry said in shock was Peter's name, as Venom kicked him to the ground and he broke the train gears, becoming more consumed and evil with the symbiote. Harry Osborn saved the people in time and exposed Peter to Uncle Ben. Harry set a trap for Peter and he would go into the Osborn residence house, and there would be a small fight between New Goblin and Venom, but Uncle Ben's voice echoed in the room after hearing that he became this monster, and he tried asking Peter to get rid of the symbiote, and he tried his best, yelling at Uncle Ben that it took him over and that he was sorry for what happened. Harry betrayed Uncle Ben and used his glider, killing Peter. He got his revenge for his father, and Uncle Ben cried, seeing that Peter was dead and the symbiote was on the ground, moving everywhere. Harry looked at the symbiote running into it, and he smiled, looking at Uncle Ben as he became Venom. The only way the true Spider-Man could be created within the comic books and movies was for someone close to Peter getting killed off. Those events somehow triggered Peter into being a more responsible person after his selfish acts, knowing that he did wrong, trying to become a better man by using his powers for good. I always thought, how would Sam Raimi's trilogy be if it was Aunt May that was killed off in the first movie and not Peter's Uncle Ben? Uncle Ben and Peter had a rocky relationship, and this could be seen during the scenes when Peter lashes out at him, but with Aunt May, maybe it wasn't like that with the two of them, as the other films like Spider-Man 2 and 3 show them having a really good relationship with each other. Let's see in scenario 3 how one little character's death would change the entire timeline, and how many changes would there be in this alternate reality. Uncle Ben was about to pick up Peter from the library like the original timeline, but this time a small event would change. Aunt May saw that Ben was trying to get to Peter because he was changing so much, but she thought that maybe she could go and pick him up at the library and talk to him and see if he was okay. Ben was good at this stuff, but she felt like she needed to try to do this since he tried to do it 2 times already. She went into the car and drove off as Uncle Ben was making dinner. Peter in our timeline beat Bonesaw and let the robber go, but when he went outside he could see that Aunt May was on the ground and he ran, telling the police that that was his Aunt May. He started crying as Aunt May died in his arms and he heard the police sirens go off. He ran, getting into his human spider costume swinging. He defeated the robber like the original timeline and went home to shock Uncle Ben about the news. Uncle Ben couldn't believe what happened and he cried, falling into his chair. The graduation still went on and Peter became Spider-Man fighting crime in New York City, learning with great power must come great responsibility, like what he did in the original timeline. He told Uncle Ben that he missed Aunt May and Uncle Ben sat down with Peter. Uncle Ben told Peter that he should have been the one to pick him up, but Aunt May, being too nice, went out of her way to do it and he became lazy, not being responsible. Peter sat up explaining to Uncle Ben that it was his fault, and he looked in the closet knowing that he needed to tell Uncle Ben the truth, and he opened the door and he revealed to Uncle Ben that he was Spider-Man. Uncle Ben smiled and he wasn't shocked at all. Peter didn't know what to think, and Uncle Ben told Peter that he knew all along that he was Spider-Man, and he explained that he's been seeing him swing here and there when he thinks that he was asleep. Peter told him that he let the robber go and it was the same robber that killed his Aunt May, and Uncle Ben forgave Peter, telling him that he was responsible and that he was happy that he told him the truth. They shook hands and Spider-Man went into the city fighting crime, and he still fought Green Goblin, and they would have their Thanksgiving dinner. Norman learned the truth about Spider-Man and he attacked Ben in this timeline, teaching him a lesson. He was at the hospital and he took a heart attack after seeing the Green Goblin, and Peter ran into the room and the doctor said, "I'm sorry son, your uncle's been killed," and everything dropped right then and there. And our scenario can change from many different ways in the new timeline, like Spider-Man hunting down Green Goblin and taking his revenge, becoming a killer, and leading into him getting the symbiote and fighting Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2 and 3. Or we can go with Uncle Ben dying with Aunt May, and Peter tries to use the lessons that his Uncle Ben taught him as they teamed up when he was Spider-Man. Option 2 seems like the better and less depressing storyline, and Peter saved Mary Jane and the kids at the end of the film, but he became the better man and knocked out the Green Goblin, learning about his true identity, and he went to Harry Osborn's house revealing that he was Spider-Man, and he threw Norman Osborn into the living room, and Harry pulled out a gun and he tried to shoot his dad, but Peter jumped in front of the bullet, letting him live. He ran his company, getting more power within the city, and Spider-Man almost became like the last stand Spider-Man, losing everything that he loved, and he only had his friends left, and he still lost his powers. But in our new timeline, he wouldn't get them back. He tried his hardest, but after everything, he couldn't get them back at all. Peter wouldn't help Otto with his machine because in this new timeline, Peter hates Norman for killing Uncle Ben, and now that Aunt May is dead, he would go into a downward spiral, losing his house and becoming homeless in New York City. Harry wouldn't live with his dad, but he would go back with Mary Jane and they would start dating again. And Peter came across the symbiote in the third movie and it boosted him up again, and he regained his powers back from the second movie, giving into power. He went to Norman's and fought him, beating him to death almost like what he did to Harry in the original Spider-Man 3 timeline. Dr. Octopus would be sidelined within the timeline after the machine actually worked, and he wouldn't be a threat, and Eddie Brock wouldn't get the symbiote because Peter stopped working at the Daily Bugle after the first film. Norman was defeated, and Spider-Man, after getting his powers back, would become Peter Parker once again, getting his old job back, and he would fight Sandman at the end of the movie and forgive him for killing his Aunt May. But in the fourth movie, he would become Venom, trying to still be a good person, and he would fight the New Goblin and the Green Goblin at the start of the fourth movie. Peter not getting the $3,000 in the movie was a massive loss for him, but it was one of the best things that could have ever happened to him because he learned a massive lesson. With great power comes great responsibility. He needed the money to get a car to impress Mary Jane at the end of the fight with Bonesaw, but what he didn't get was the money, and his selfishness kicked in, and he felt that everything he worked for was wasted, and he let the robber go, and all of the original events kicked off. But what if this didn't happen? But what if he actually got the $3,000 in the film in the first act of the movie? What if Peter stole the money from the guy getting the car to impress Mary Jane? The scenario changes really fast in our new timeline. The wrestling host counted his money as he saw Peter leave the building, and the robber went into the room with a gun. He yelled demanding for the money, and Peter opened the elevator door and he walked into the elevator, and the door was about to shut, but the robber ran out of the room and he was about to catch the door, until Peter saw this as an opportunity to take back what he won, and he used his webs to grab the bag of money, and the elevator door shut. Peter ran out of the building and he could see Flint Marko walk past him. His spider sense went off as he dodged an attack from Flint Marko, and he knocked him out cold and he fell to the ground. Peter ran out of the door and he walked back into Uncle Ben's car, and Peter in our new timeline, instead of becoming Spider-Man, went into a car dealership and he bought the car he saw in the paper, and he did impress Mary Jane with it, picking her up in the new vehicle, and they would be together in this new timeline, and Harry wouldn't be able to get with Mary Jane. Peter was becoming a selfish person, not using his powers for good, but only when he wanted to use his powers, and he showed MJ the kind of strength that he had throughout the second act of the film, and he slowly was turning into Flash Thompson with his new car, thinking he was the smartest kid in class, and he didn't learn with great power comes great responsibility. He still was Spider-Man taking criminals out, and he fought the Green Goblin like the original timeline, but it was only for fun as he didn't really care for crime fighting. Peter having Mary Jane would change everything because he would give up being Spider-Man, seeing that he needed to spend more time with her, and Green Goblin lived in this timeline at the end of Spider-Man 2002. Because there wouldn't be a fight at the end of the movie, and Norman couldn't find out that Peter was Spider-Man because Spider-Man only made rare appearances in New York when he really wanted to. Green Goblin got the company back, and in Spider-Man 2 he would hire Otto Octavius. Harry would become a board member at Oscorp, and Peter, like the original timeline, worked with Otto in Spider-Man 2, and since the fight didn't happen between Norman Osborn and Peter Parker, they didn't know each other's secret identities. Peter and Otto would become closer friends, almost like Spider-Man PS4, and they would work on the machine, but it would fail, and Norman Osborn would cut funding for their project. Otto turned evil after getting the arms, and he would fight Green Goblin after finding out Norman Osborn was the Green Goblin during their fight. Spider-Man would swing into action, seeing the fight go down, and it would be on the same train from Spider-Man 2, and Spider-Man defeated Green Goblin, and Doc Ock fought Spider-Man, betraying him. He still wanted money after not being able to fund it, and Spider-Man and Otto Octavius would battle it out in the third act of the film, and Harry Osborn was held hostage for leverage. Spider-Man learned the truth about Norman Osborn, and they still fought at the end of Spider-Man 2, and Spider-Man saved Harry Osborn. Spider-Man 3 was very different because Spider-Man still got the symbiote, but with Uncle Ben being alive for help and guidance, he would be able to remove the symbiote early in the movie, and the symbiote died, not being able to bond with anybody, and Harry wouldn't become the new Goblin after learning his father was the Green Goblin. Peter and Mary Jane would get married like the original Amazing Spider-Man comic books, and Eddie Brock wouldn't get the symbiote in Spider-Man 3 since it died early in the film. Peter gave up being Spider-Man to start a family, and everyone in this timeline would live in this alternate reality. That is going to be our 4 scenarios with these alternate branched realities, and I think the one that I really liked writing the most was the second scenario where Peter gets the symbiote in the first movie, and it was a really highly requested what if to make, so I thought I would try to bring something new to the table, and it was a really unique thing to do by twisting the storyline. I also want to give a big thank you for the support for this new series, as I will try to make it shorter, but break down the events in the timeline by twisting and turning it, and really changing how events could play out. Do make sure to request your fan fictions and scenarios in the comments down below, and I will be covering more Amazing Spider-Man and MCU ones with this series. But anyways, as always, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. But anyways, as always guys, thanks for tuning in and have an amazing day.